My husband won't even look at me after I cheated. Help. Hey everyone. I never thought I'd be posting here, but I don't know what else to do. For context, I'm Lena, 32, and up until recently my life was pretty much perfect. At least, I thought it was until I made the biggest mistake of my life and destroyed everything. And no, I won't try to paint myself as the victim because I'm not. I did this. I ruined my marriage, and now, no matter how hard I try, my husband won't even look at me the same way anymore. I cheated. 19 months ago, my husband, Ethan, 39, found out about my affair with a neighbor, Jake, 27, who, by the way, was also married and had kids of his own. I'll never forget the way Ethan looked at me when he found out. Like I wasn't even the person he thought I was. Like I was nothing. That look still haunts me. I know what you're thinking. If my marriage was so great, why did I cheat? The truth is, I don't even have a good reason. I loved Ethan. I still love him. We had a great life together. He was an amazing husband and father to our two boys, 9 and 11. There was nothing wrong in our marriage. No neglect, no lack of affection. He always made me feel wanted, loved, and yet I still messed it up. The affair lasted for 5 months, but I was only with Jake 4 times in total. And no, I don't expect anyone to believe me when I say that, but it's the truth. It wasn't some grand love affair. It was just physical, stupid, reckless. If I had to explain why it happened, I think it goes back to something deep inside me. Something I don't even fully understand. The first time I saw Jake, it was like something inside me switched on. That kind of raw, instinctual attraction that I hadn't felt in years. The last time I felt anything like it was when I was 18, when I met the guy who took my virginity, Ryan. Ryan was my first everything. It wasn't love, but it was intense, obsessive, feral. Looking back, we had nothing in common, and the relationship was doomed from the start, but at the moment I was powerless against that kind of chemistry. I ended things with Ryan after a year, and not long after, I met Ethan. Unlike Ryan, Ethan was safe, reliable, the kind of guy I could build a future with. I knew I wouldn't get that same all-consuming attraction with him, but what I did have with him was so much more meaningful. Real love. We built an amazing life together. 13 years of happiness. And then, Jake came along and shattered everything. Jake and his wife, Melissa, moved into our neighborhood 2 years ago. Ethan and I were one of the younger couples in the area, so when Jake and Melissa arrived, they were instantly welcomed into our little community. That's when it started. The first time I saw Jake was at a neighborhood picnic. The moment our eyes met, I felt that same wild, irrational pull that I hadn't felt since Ryan. It was instant, electric, and dangerous, and I knew that it was wrong. I tried to ignore it, but then we ran into him again, this time at the car dealership where he worked in finance. Ethan and I were looking for a new SUV, and when Ethan found out Jake worked there, they hit it off immediately. We ended up buying the car, and Jake handled our financing. Throughout the entire process, he and I kept making eye contact. It was subtle, but it was there. I told myself it was just in my head, that I was imagining things. But deep down, I knew I wasn't. A few days later, I had to go back to the dealership alone to get some mud flaps installed. That's when everything crossed the line. Jake saw me in the waiting area and asked me to come back to his office to talk. He made coffee, we chatted, and then, out of nowhere, he told me straight up, "I can't stop thinking about you." I remember feeling my stomach drop. I should have shut it down right then and there. I should have walked out. Instead, I admitted that I felt something too, and that was the beginning of the end. The next morning, while our kids were at school and our spouses were at work, I was in his bed. I wish I could tell you that guilt hit me the second it happened. That I stopped, realized what I was doing, and walked away. But I didn't. Instead, I let myself get caught up in the secrecy, the thrill, the rush of something I knew I shouldn't have. I convinced myself it wasn't a big deal, that if I kept it purely physical, it wouldn't actually mean anything. But that was a lie, a dangerous one. Jake and I met up 3 more times over the next few months. Always in his house, always during the day, always under the false assumption that I was still in control. I kept telling myself that as long as Ethan never found out, nothing had to change. My family, my life, everything would stay the same. That illusion shattered on a Thursday morning 19 months ago. The day I lost everything. There's a certain kind of panic that takes over when you realize you've been caught. It's not gradual. It's immediate, like an electric shock to your system. One second, Jake and I were in his bedroom. The next, his front door opened, and a voice cut through the silence. Sharp, furious, unmistakably filled with rage. His mother-in-law had walked in on us. I barely had time to react before she was in the doorway, face twisted in fury. The moment she saw me, it was like something inside her snapped. She stormed toward us, not hesitating for even a second. Jake got it first. A slap so hard it left a mark across his face. Then she turned on me, hands gripping my hair, nails scraping against my skin as she dragged me toward the door. I scrambled to grab my clothes, shaking so badly I could barely dress myself. My mind was blank, running on pure adrenaline. I stumbled out the door, barely aware of anything except the fact that I had just destroyed my life. By the time I got into my car, my hands were trembling so hard that I struggled to start the engine. My heart was racing, my stomach twisting in ways that made me feel physically sick. As I drove away, reality hit me like a ton of bricks. Ethan was going to find out. I knew I had to get home before Melissa or her mother got to him first. I had to tell him myself. When I pulled into our driveway, the house was silent. I walked inside and just sat on the couch, staring at nothing, my mind racing. What was I supposed to say? How could I possibly explain this? I picked up my phone and called Ethan. Straight to voicemail. I tried again and again. Nothing. I sent him a text. I need to talk to you. It's important. Please come home. Still nothing. And that's when I knew. Melissa or her mother had already told him. Not even an hour later, a pounding on the front door jolted me out of my thoughts. I jumped so hard I nearly dropped my phone. Melissa and her mom were outside, yelling loudly enough for the entire neighborhood to hear. I didn't answer. Couldn't. I just stood there, frozen, heart hammering as they banged on the windows, the door, shouting every insult imaginable. They were making sure I knew exactly what they thought of me. Eventually, they left, but the damage was already done. I collapsed onto the couch, curled into myself, and sobbed. I don't know how long I stayed like that, long enough to feel like I was drowning in my shame. Then I heard it. Car door outside. Ethan. I ran to the bathroom, splashed water on my face, and tried to make myself look somewhat normal. I had no idea what I was going to say, but I knew I had to face him. I took a deep breath, walked back into the living room, and waited for him to come in. But he didn't. Instead, I watched through the window as he walked right past our house, straight to Jake and Melissa's. He was in there for 3 hours before he came home. When he finally walked through the door, I rushed toward him, desperate to explain, to beg for forgiveness. He stopped me cold. He wouldn't let me touch him. And then, in the coldest voice I'd ever heard from him, he told me to pack my things and leave. I didn't move, couldn't. My body just shut down, refusing to process what was happening. The look in Ethan's eyes was worse than anger. It was emptiness, like I wasn't even a person to him anymore, just a stranger standing in his home. I begged him to talk to me, to at least listen before making any decisions. He didn't raise his voice, didn't explode. That would have been easier to handle. Instead, he just repeated himself, his voice completely void of emotion. Pack your things. I want you out. My legs gave out, and I dropped to my knees, pleading with him, telling him I'd do anything to fix this, that I knew I had destroyed everything, but I would spend the rest of my life making it up to him. He didn't react, didn't say a word, just turned around and walked away, leaving me there, sobbing into the floor. Then he did something I never expected. He called my mother. I sat there, stunned, as I listened to him tell her everything. Every awful detail, every betrayal. He spoke in the same cold, detached voice, like he was reading off a script. When he was done, he asked her to come pick me up. 15 minutes later, my mom showed up, tears already streaming down her face. She didn't say much, just apologized to Ethan over and over before turning to me. Her expression filled with disappointment and heartbreak. She practically had to drag me out of the house. I begged Ethan to at least let me explain to the kids, to say something to them before I left. He cut me off immediately. I'll handle it. That was the last thing he said before shutting the door in my face. I don't remember much about that night, just that I cried so hard it felt like my body was shutting down. My parents barely spoke, sitting in stunned silence as I fell apart on their couch. When I finally stopped crying long enough to form a sentence, I called Ethan. To my surprise, he answered. I told him how sorry I was, how I'd never do anything like this again, that I would do anything to fix what I had broken. All I got in response was silence. When I finished, I asked him how he was feeling. His answer was short. You know how I feel. Then he told me he wanted me to stay at my parents' house for at least 2 weeks before we had another conversation. I agreed, desperate for even the smallest chance to fix things. I asked if I could see the kids. He refused but said he'd let me have a short phone call with them before bedtime. That was it. Before he hung up, I told him I loved him. He said nothing. The following nights were the same. I would call, apologize, and beg, and he would just listen in silence before hanging up. Then, 5 days later, he finally spoke. I want a divorce. Felt like the air had been sucked out of the room. I lost it completely, sobbing so hard I could barely breathe. I begged him to reconsider, pleaded for one more chance, but he cut me off. I'll lose half of everything I've worked for, but I don't even care. You can have it all. Just leave me and the boys alone. That hurt worse than anything. He wasn't even worried about the financial hit. He just wanted to erase me from his life. I knew if I didn't do something drastic, this would be the end. So I came up with a plan. The next morning, while Ethan was meeting with his divorce attorney, I met with a lawyer of my own. Not to prepare for a divorce, but to create a postnuptial agreement. It was my last chance. I went to 4 different attorneys before I found one who specialized in postnups and was willing to draft an agreement that was completely lopsided in Ethan's favor. I didn't care. I just needed a way to prove that I was willing to fight for him, no matter the cost. 2 weeks later, I was served with divorce papers. The very next day, I had Ethan served with my postnuptial agreement. That night, he called me. For the first time since this nightmare started, his voice wasn't entirely cold. You're serious about this? I told him I was. That I wasn't trying to manipulate him. That this was my way of proving I would never betray him again. He didn't say much after that, but I could tell he was thinking, considering it. And for the first time in weeks, I felt the tiniest bit of hope. Finally, he gave me an answer. I'll agree with one condition. Ethan's condition was simple, but it hit me like a punch to the gut. I don't want to be your husband. Not in the way you want me to be. If we stay married, it's for the kids. That's it. I didn't argue. Couldn't. I knew I had no right to ask for more. If this was the only way I could stay in his life, even as a ghost of what we once were, I'd take it. The postnuptial agreement was brutal. It gave him nearly everything, the house, the savings, the investments. If I ever cheated again, I'd walk away with nothing. No claim to marital assets, no alimony, no financial support whatsoever. On top of that, he had zero obligation to be intimate with me. The message was clear. I could stay in his house, in his life, but I'd never truly have him again. Not the way I wanted. I signed it anyway. The first few months were unbearable. We were strangers living under the same roof. Ethan barely acknowledged me. He wouldn't eat anything I cooked, wouldn't sit next to me on the couch, and wouldn't even look at me unless absolutely necessary. The worst part? He refused to be seen with me in public. Anytime we had to be in the same place, our kids' games, school functions, he would stand far away, acting like I wasn't even there. The only exception was vacations. It was like some unspoken rule. Whenever we traveled, we shared space. Not a bed, not even the same room, but we existed together. I don't know if it was because being away from home made things easier or if it was just his way of keeping up appearances. Those trips became the only time I felt close to him. At night, in the quiet of hotel rooms, I'd find myself watching him, wondering if there was still something left, some tiny piece of him that still cared. But every time I reached for him, even just to hold his hand, he pulled away. 17 months have passed. I call it our second marriage, but in reality, it's just a contract. We are nothing more than 2 people raising children under the same roof. He still won't touch me, won't hug me, won't kiss me. I try sometimes. I'll get in a quick hug before he can stop me just to feel something, anything. But I know he hates it. I stopped trying after a while. The only thing he demands is that I take monthly at-home STD tests. Even though he won't touch me, he still doesn't trust me. I don't blame him. He also refuses to leave the neighborhood. I've asked, begged, for us to move, to start fresh somewhere new, away from the stairs, away from the whispers. He refuses. His reasoning, I'm not uprooting my kids because of you. The worst part is that, despite everything, Ethan's social life never changed. All the neighborhood men still see him the same way, a great guy, a devoted father. They invite him over, they come to our house for cigars and bourbon on the back porch. Meanwhile, the women, they want nothing to do with me. The neighborhood shunned me. I became invisible overnight. I used to have friends here. Other moms I was close with, women I'd spent years building relationships with. Yeah? They don't even look at me. They weren't just mad at me for the affair, they were protecting their marriages. I heard the rumors. They saw me as a risk. If I could cheat on a man like Ethan, what was stopping me from going after their husbands, too? Melissa and Jake divorced 8 months after everything happened, but she and her kids still live down the street. Our sons still play together, which means I see her a lot. She doesn't acknowledge me. I don't blame her for that either. So, I stay inside. I avoid the front yard and the neighborhood. My home feels like a prison now, but it's the only place I have. Ethan is still Ethan, structured, disciplined, a man of routine. He goes to work, goes to the gym, and then comes home. He never eats dinner with us anymore. When our boys have games, we take turns. He takes them some days, I take them others. When he does show up, he stands on the sidelines with the other dads, never near me. The only time we act remotely like a family is in the backyard, our one neutral space. That's where I find the only bit of peace left in my life. When Ethan isn't home, my boys and I cook together, we tend to the garden I built, we make new recipes and laugh over our failures. They're the only ones who don't treat me differently. For them, I have to keep going. I know what people will say. That this isn't a marriage. That I should walk away. And maybe I should. But here's the truth, I love Ethan. I always have. I always will. And I don't know if I can let go. But I also don't know if he'll ever see me as his wife again. Every day, I tell myself that things will get better. That one morning, Ethan will wake up and decide he's ready to forgive me. That he'll look at me like he used to before I ruined everything. But deep down, I know I'm lying to myself. Because the truth is, I don't think he's ever coming back to me. At this point, I'm just holding on to a ghost of the life we had, hoping that if I stay long enough, something will shift. That he'll see I'm still here, still trying. But the longer this goes on, the more I wonder if I'm only making it worse. The moment I realized that came on a random Tuesday evening. I had just finished cooking dinner, setting the table like I always did, even though I knew Ethan wouldn't join us. It had become a habit, one I couldn't break, even after months of him ignoring it. The boys and I were sitting down to eat when I heard the garage door open. Ethan was home earlier than usual. My heart jumped, a tiny, ridiculous part of me hoping that maybe tonight would be different. He walked into the kitchen and didn't even glance at me. Instead, he went straight to the fridge, grabbed a protein shake, and turned to leave. I don't know what came over me, but I reached for him. Just a touch, a hand on his arm, nothing more. He flinched like I had burned him. For a second, he looked at me, really looked at me, and all I saw was exhaustion. Like he was tired of me, this house, this situation, everything. And then he said it. The one thing I hadn't let myself consider. I don't know how much longer I can do this. I froze. He wasn't angry. He wasn't even cold. He just sounded done. I forced out a shaky, "What do you mean?" He sighed, rubbing a hand over his face. This. Us. Whatever this is. I couldn't breathe. It was the closest he had come to admitting this wasn't working. I panicked. I started listing all the reasons we should stay together, the kids, the post-nup, the time we had already invested in the second chance. I was desperate, clinging to anything that would make him stay. But his face never changed. "I hear you, Lena," he said quietly. "But I don't think this is ever going to be what you want it to be." I felt my throat tighten. "You don't love me anymore." He didn't answer right away. And somehow that was worse than if he had just said no. After a long pause, he finally muttered, "I don't know. I should have stopped there. But I couldn't. Is there someone else?" He exhaled sharply, shaking his head. "No. And there never will be. But that doesn't change anything." The room was so quiet I could hear the clock ticking on the wall. The boys were still eating in the other room, completely unaware that their mother was watching her marriage collapse in real time. I wanted to argue, to fight, to tell him he was wrong. But what could I say? He was right. We weren't a couple. We weren't even friends. We were just two people trapped in a life we no longer shared. I had spent so much time trying to fix things, trying to hold on to him, that I never considered the possibility that he didn't want to be fixed. That maybe he wasn't angry anymore. Maybe he was just done. That night, I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, replaying our conversation over and over. For the first time, I let myself wonder if I had already lost him for good. And for the first time, I considered something I never had before. Maybe the best way to prove my love for him was to finally let him go. I barely slept that night. Every time I closed my eyes, my mind raced through every mistake I had made, every chance I had to fix things but failed. For the past 17 months, I had been clinging to this marriage like a drowning person grips a life raft. I thought if I just stayed, if I kept proving my love, Ethan would eventually come around. But now, for the first time, I had to ask myself a terrifying question. What if holding on was only making it worse? By the time morning came, I had made my decision. I needed to leave. Not permanently, not at first. Just for a while. I didn't want a divorce. I didn't know if I'd ever be ready for that. But I couldn't keep living in a house where my husband wouldn't look at me, wouldn't speak to me, wouldn't even sit at the same table as me. And if there was even a chance that space could make him see me differently, maybe even miss me, then I had to take it. I spent the morning searching for short-term rentals. Nothing too far, just enough distance to breathe. When Ethan came home that night, I was waiting for him. "I need to talk to you," I said quietly. He looked wary, like he was bracing for another desperate attempt to fix things. But this time my voice didn't shake. "I'm moving out for a little while." For the first time in months, I saw something flicker in his expression. Surprise. He wasn't expecting this. I expected him to ask why, to demand an explanation, but he didn't. Instead, he just studied me for a long moment before saying, "Okay." That was it. No arguments, no relief, just acceptance. I told the boys later that night. I kept it simple, telling them Mom needed some time to herself but that nothing was changing between us. They could stay with me whenever they wanted. They took it better than I expected. I don't know if that made it easier or harder. A week later, I packed my things and left. The first few days were unbearable. I had spent so long fighting to stay that I didn't know how to exist outside of our home. The silence was suffocating, the emptiness of the apartment only amplifying the ache in my chest. I missed everything. The smell of Ethan's cologne was lingering in the bathroom. The sound of the boys laughing from their rooms. Even the painful, suffocating tension that filled our house every single day, because at least then, I was there. But something strange happened after the first week. I started to feel lighter. For the first time in months, I didn't have to tiptoe around my own home. I wasn't constantly measuring my words, watching Ethan's body language, bracing myself for the cold rejection I had been living with every day. And I realized something I never expected. Maybe I needed the space just as much as he did. I had been so focused on holding on, so terrified of losing him, that I never stopped to ask myself what I actually wanted. Not just what I was willing to sacrifice, but what I truly deserved. Ethan and I barely spoke during the first few weeks. I kept waiting for him to miss me, to call first, to show even the smallest sign that my absence mattered. But he didn't. Whenever I called to check in, he was polite, even civil. But there was no hesitation in his voice, no sadness, no longing, just distance. And for the first time, I started to believe that maybe, just maybe, he really had already let me go. The realization nearly broke me. But instead of calling him, instead of begging, I did something else. I stayed away. And then, after 2 months, Ethan finally reached out first. Ethan's message was short, simple. "Can we talk?" That was it. No explanation, no emotion, just a request. I stared at my phone for a long time before responding. My heart was pounding, my hands shaking, because I knew this was it. We met at a coffee shop, neutral ground. I got there early, nerves twisting in my stomach, wondering what he was going to say. Was he ready to try again? Did he want me to come home? Or was this the moment he finally told me he wanted to end it for good? When he walked in, I barely recognized him. He looked lighter, like a weight had been lifted off his shoulders. And that's when I knew. Before he even opened his mouth, before he even sat down, I knew what he was about to say. And I wasn't wrong. "I think we should get divorced." I had imagined this moment 1,000 times. Thought I'd break down, beg him to reconsider, grasp at anything to keep him from saying those words. But instead I just nodded. Because deep down I had known for a long time that this was where we were heading. "I still care about you," he said. "I always will. But I don't think we'll ever be happy like this." I swallowed the lump in my throat, forcing myself to hold it together. "I understand," I whispered, and for the first time I meant it. There was no more fighting, no more begging, no more pretending. Just the quiet, painful truth. Ethan wasn't punishing me anymore. He wasn't even angry. He had just moved on. And it was time for me to do the same. The divorce was finalized a few months later. I gave him everything. The house, the savings, all of it. He didn't ask for that, but I insisted. I had taken enough from him already. He fought me on it, told me to take my fair share, but I refused. I walked away with nothing but the money I had saved from my new job. And I was okay with that. For the first time in a long time, I wasn't clinging to something that wasn't mine anymore. Ethan kept his promise. He never turned into the bitter ex-husband. We stayed civil for the boys, kept communication open, and made sure they never felt torn between us. But we were no longer a family. Not the way we once were. And that was a loss I had to grieve on my own. It's been a year since the divorce. People always ask if I regret what I did. And the answer is easy. Yes, every single day. If I could go back in time, if I could erase that moment when I crossed the line, I would. But that's the thing about mistakes, you don't get to undo them. You just have to live with the consequences. And I do. Every time I come home to an empty apartment. Every time I see Ethan at a school event and he smiles at me like I'm just another person in the crowd. Every time my kids talk about their dad with the same admiration and love they always have, but never ask when we'll all be together again. That's my punishment. Not the divorce. Not the money. But knowing that I had everything, I threw it away. So, if you're listening this story and you're in a situation where you think you can have it both ways, stop. Don't do what I did. Because once you break something, you can't always fix it. And sometimes, the person you love the most won't wait around to see if you will. Hope you enjoyed this story as much as I do. Help this small channel grow by hitting that like button, subscribing, and sharing with your friends. Every bit of support means the world. Thanks for watching and see you in the next one.